Introduction. On the 30th of November 2022, YouTuber Simon Clark made an excellent video on the lengthy history of climate change science. It's a remarkably compact, accessible, and informative overview of the field's development, and I hope it's picked up and used widely by teachers and science educators. The video made several claims about Eunice Foote, a 19th century scientist who made an important observation related to climate change, and in this section, Simon made a few missteps. This is the first of two videos correcting historical errors in Simon's video and providing additional commentary on the subject, covering these topics. 1. Were Foote's patents in her husband's name? 2. Was Foote's scientific paper a first for women? 3. Did Foote discover the greenhouse effect? 4. Did Foote predict global warming? Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Please note that this is not a takedown or attack, just a supportive critique. I'll be correcting mistakes I think Simon has made, but I'll also be providing evidence strengthening some of his other points and noting where he has avoided or even corrected errors typically committed by writers on this subject. Incidentally, I made my own video on Eunice Foote back on the 8th of December 2021, and it's only 5 minutes long, so if you're interested in that, see the link in the video description. Were Foote's patents in her husband's name? Simon provides a good general introduction to Foote's early life and then says this, quote, "She invented a paper-making machine, a thermostatically controlled stove, and less squeaky shoes, and she was a scientist. But of course, she was those things in a society in which to be a woman was to be excluded. While she was an inventor, her inventions were patented in her husband's name as women couldn't defend patents in court." End quote. This looks like it has been paraphrased from the Wikipedia article on Eunice Foote. I apologise to Simon if this isn't the case, but the similarity in wording is very strong, and I didn't find this in any of the 3 books Simon told me he used as his main sources, so I'm making an inference. Right now, I'll point out that I'm not faulting Simon for using the Wikipedia article, if that's what he did, especially since this particular paragraph is supported by several citations and consequently does look very convincing. I've placed the relevant section of the Wikipedia article on screen now. Wikipedia uses the phrase thermostatically controlled cooking stove. Simon uses the phrase thermostatically controlled cooking stove. Wikipedia says Eunice's inventions were typically patented in her husband's name. Simon says her inventions were patented in her husband's name. Wikipedia says married women could not defend patents in court, and Simon says women couldn't defend patents in court. Though the wording isn't exactly the same, and the Wikipedia article is slightly more nuanced, the order of these phrases in Simon's video is exactly the same order as in the Wikipedia article, and the second and third phrases are in one sentence in both the Wikipedia article and Simon's video. I mentioned that this paragraph in the Wikipedia article is supported by citations, and the information about Foote and her patents in particular is supported by a couple of citations from an article by science writer Rachel Brazil. The wording in the article is almost identical to the wording which appears in Wikipedia, so it's even possible Simon actually went straight to Brazil's article instead of using Wikipedia, though he has included information which isn't in Brazil's article, such as a reference to an improved footwear patent, which is in the Wikipedia article. However, I noticed Brazil doesn't cite any sources for her article, so her claims about Foote's patents are unsupported. Regardless of whether Brazil or the Wikipedia article was Simon's source, the Wikipedia article on Foote has several errors, and this is one of them. In fact, looking earlier in the Wikipedia article, we find more accurate information which actually contradicts what the later part said. This is not uncommon for a Wikipedia article. The earlier section of this article says, quote, "Eunice filed a patent in her own name in 1860 on a shoe and boot insert made of a single piece of vulcanized rubber to, quote, prevent the squeaking of boots and shoes," end quote. On screen now, you can see a scan of this patent, which opens with the typically formulaic patent wording of the day, quote, "Be it known that I, Eunice N. Foote of Saratoga Springs, in the county of Saratoga and state of New York, have invented an improvement in boots and shoes," end quote. Contrary to Brazil's claim that women were unable to apply for patents at this time, Foote's filing of a patent in her own name was not remotely revolutionary. In fact, the first woman in the US to apply for and receive a patent in her own name was Mary Keyes, all the way back in 1809, who used a law passed in 1790, which was worded to allow, quote, any person or persons, end quote, to file a patent application without reference to gender. Was Foote's scientific paper a first for women? At around 7 minutes and 8 seconds, Simon makes this statement about the most significant scientific contribution Foote ever made and the entire reason why she features in his video. Quote, so, when she published Circumstances Affecting the Heat of the Sun's Rays in the American Journal of Science and Arts in 1856, it was the first ever publication by a female author in any scientific journal other than those dedicated to astronomy. End quote. That looks like another paraphrase straight from the Wikipedia article on Eunice Foote, which says, quote, other than those on astronomy, the paper was the first known publication anywhere in a scientific journal in the field by a woman. End quote. Very close to Simon's wording, quote, the first ever publication by a female author in any scientific journal other than those dedicated to astronomy, end quote. Again, my apologies to Simon if this was not his source. The statement in Wikipedia is given a citation, an article by science author Jeff Hecht, and as with the previous example, it's possible Simon simply used Hecht's article instead of Wikipedia. However, I think this is unlikely because the Wikipedia article doesn't say quite what Hecht does. There's a very important difference in the wording. The Wikipedia article says, quote, other than those on astronomy, the paper was the first known publication anywhere in a scientific journal in the field by a woman, end quote. Very close to Simon's wording, quote, the first ever publication by a female author in any scientific journal other than those dedicated to astronomy, end quote. However, Hecht says something different, writing, quote, she was the first American woman to publish on physics, not counting astronomy, end quote. Simon's wording is nearly identical to that of the Wikipedia article and distinctly different from Hecht's, which confines the uniqueness of Foote's publication to American women and the field of physics. Hecht's claim may well be true, I haven't checked, but the Wikipedia article's claim is not. Foote's paper was preceded by at least 30 years by scientist Mary Somerville, a Scot. In 1826, Somerville published a 6-page paper in the prestigious scientific journal Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London, entitled On the Magnetizing Power of the More Refrangible Solar Rays. In it, she explained she was testing a hypothesis about magnetism proposed by Professor Moricchini and described her experimental methodology. This paper was very obviously not about astronomy. In 1846, Somerville had an 11-page paper published in the same scientific journal, this one entitled On the Action of the Rays of the Spectrum on Vegetable Juices. Again, it described in detail her scientific hypothesis and experimental methodology. Again, certainly not about astronomy. Somerville's scholarly output was prodigious, and although she only wrote a couple of journal papers, she continued writing on a range of scientific subjects, producing a number of monographs, some of which became standard science textbooks. Although she faced the typical social challenges of a woman in 19th century Victorian England, in scientific circles, she was widely recognised and respected greatly. She was made a member of scientific societies in England, Ireland, America, France, and Italy, and granted an annual pension by the Crown for her contributions to scientific knowledge. On her death, her obituary in the newspaper The Morning Post from London included the statement, quote, whatever difficulty we might experience in the middle of the 19th century in choosing a king of science, there could be no question whatever as to the queen of science, end quote. Did Foote discover the greenhouse effect? At around 7 minutes 21 seconds, Simon makes this statement about Foote's experiment. Quote, in her paper, she detailed experiments she conducted with different gases trapped inside glass cylinders and heated by the sun. She noted that when she filled a cylinder with carbonic acid gas, carbon dioxide, it was heated to a higher temperature by sunlight, and crucially retained its heat much longer than those cylinders filled with other gases. She correctly identified Fourier's heat-trapping property of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide didn't obscure sunlight, but it absorbed thermal radiation, and by being present in the atmosphere, even in very modest quantities, This increased the average temperature of the Earth." End quote. This is where things get interesting. Simon's description of Foote's experiments is accurate, but his description of her conclusions is incorrect. It's true that carbon dioxide absorbs thermal radiation, that is, infrared radiation, but there's no evidence Foote knew this herself. That might seem confusing since she came to the correct conclusion that carbon dioxide could act as an insulating agent trapping heat, but the fact is her experiment was not measuring thermal radiation, and her equipment actually couldn't. It wasn't even designed to. Instead, Foote appears to attribute the heating effect to solar light radiation, making explicit reference to the visible light of the sun. She wrote, quote, "My investigations have had for their object to determine the different circumstances that affect the thermal action of the rays of light that proceed from the sun." End quote. It's puzzling that Foote attributed the heating effect she detected to the visible light from the sun, because at the time she was conducting her experiment, it was already known that visible light from the sun was not the primary mechanism responsible for the Earth's warming, but rather the sun's invisible infrared light. We'll return to this point later to see the significance of this distinction. In his foundational work on the physics of global temperature back in the 1820s, Joseph Fourier had explained the theory of how the Earth's temperature could be raised by the atmosphere trapping thermal radiation from the sun, citing an experiment by meteorologist Horace-Bénédict de Saussure. Fourier described how de Saussure's experiment demonstrated how the atmospheric temperature, heated by absorbing infrared radiation from the sun, in turn heated the surface of the Earth. The experiment used a box with glass walls. Note that this is actually referred to as a hot box. It's not strictly a greenhouse, but this is the source of the greenhouse metaphor, which was actually attributed to Fourier in a comment made by Arvid Högboom at the end of the 19th century. In his comments on de Saussure's work, Fourier writes explicitly, quote, "The heat of the sun has properties different from those of heat without light," end quote, differentiating between visible light and invisible thermal radiation. This is a distinction Foote did not make. Fourier then explained that once the sun's rays entered the hot box, quote, "their heat thus communicated ceases to be luminous, that is visible, and preserves only the properties of non-luminous, that is invisible, radiating heat. In this state, it cannot pass through the plates of glass covering the vessel," end quote. This was an explicit description of how the sun's thermal radiation is trapped by the Earth's atmosphere. At around 8 minutes 45 seconds, Simon says this, quote, "Foote's work was mostly lost in a fire at the Smithsonian Institute in 1865, so she was forgotten for most of subsequent history. Her results were only rediscovered in 2011. So while you may have heard of Tyndall, Foote was actually the first person, despite many obstacles, to discover that carbon dioxide kept the Earth warmer than it otherwise would be." End quote. Firstly, there's some evidence that Foote was not the first person to discover that carbon dioxide kept the Earth warmer than it otherwise would be. In fact, the relationship of carbon dioxide to the Earth's temperature was already a topic of active discussion in her time, which very likely prompted her research. We'll get to that later. Secondly, the reason why people remember Tyndall rather than Foote is that Foote's experiment did not help scientists understand the physics of climate change. Her experiment was only capable of measuring sunlight, not the long-wave infrared, which actually causes global warming. Consequently, Ortiz and Jackson write that her experiment, quote, "did not measure the natural greenhouse effect of the Earth's atmosphere by specifically using long-wave infrared," end quote. Nor does it seem Foote even understood that it was infrared which causes global warming. Likewise, planetary scientist Ralph Lorenz notes that Foote's work, quote, "is not a discovery of the greenhouse effect. If anything, it is the opposite, that is, an anti-greenhouse effect, the absorption of sunlight rather than thermal infrared," end quote. Climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe observes, quote, "her rudimentary experimental design of simply putting jars out in the sun did not actually allow her to isolate the effects of the infrared heat radiation given off by the Earth from the higher wavelength energy given off by the sun," end quote. Consequently, Hayhoe comments, quote, her conclusion that carbon dioxide traps more heat than the other gases she measured is more serendipitous than evidential, end quote. In other words, it was a lucky inference rather than a conclusion indicated by her experimental results. Biochemist Roland Jackson concurs, writing, quote, Foote did not give any clear explanation of the greenhouse effect, end quote, observing, quote, she may have unwittingly detected it, end quote, but that, quote, as she made no comment on those results, we can only surmise that she didn't recognize what might be the cause, end quote. In contrast, Jackson points out Tyndall deliberately measured the long-wave infrared radiation which he knew was responsible for warming the Earth and which he knew was trapped by the atmosphere. Additionally, Jackson observes Tyndall also, quote, explained the greenhouse effect in terms of the absorption and radiation of heat by gases, including carbon dioxide and water vapor, in the atmosphere, end quote. Ortiz and Jackson likewise explain, quote, Foote did not explicitly theorize or investigate what we now call the greenhouse effect, end quote, and add that her experimental data, quote, do not provide a direct measure of the full natural greenhouse effect, end quote. However, they still acknowledge Foote did show carbon dioxide has an insulating property which can increase the Earth's atmospheric temperature. Nevertheless, they also observe that despite reaching the correct conclusion that water vapor could increase atmospheric temperature, quote, her mechanistic understanding as to why was incorrect, end quote. Did Foote predict global warming? It's important to understand exactly what Foote did and didn't say, since many articles online not only attribute the discovery of the greenhouse effect to Foote, but also the actual foundation of climate science. One of Simon's sources, the book Our Biggest Experiment, An Epic History of the Climate Crisis by Alice Bell, makes the claim that Foote, quote, first warned the world that an atmosphere heavy with carbon dioxide could send temperatures soaring, end quote, adding, quote, at the time, no one paid much attention, end quote. But this isn't true. Foote didn't make any such warning at all, and in fact never even mentioned the possible impact of carbon dioxide on the future of the Earth's temperature. It is to Simon's credit that he avoided citing this claim, given how many times it has been made by numerous articles online, giving it the appearance of reality. You can see articles everywhere with titles such as Eunice Foote, the Mother of Climate Change, and Eunice Foote's pioneering research on CO2 and climate warming, and scientists understood physics of climate change in the 1800s, thanks to a woman named Eunice Foote. And, most egregiously of all, this suffrage-supporting scientist defined the greenhouse effect, but didn't get the credit because sexism, which is sheer clickbait. The actual article beneath the title is far more moderate in its description of the historical events. The fact is, Foote never made any prediction about future global warming. Her experiments were directed entirely at understanding the Earth's temperature in the past. This is clear from her own words. Commenting on the insulating properties of carbon dioxide, Foote wrote, quote, an atmosphere of that gas would give to our Earth a high temperature, and if, as some suppose, at one period of its history, the air had mixed with it a larger proportion than at present, an increased temperature from its own action, as well as from increased weight, must necessarily have resulted, end quote. Note the repeated use of past tense here. She speaks of Earth, quote, at one period of its history, end quote, not its future, and said, quote, the air had mixed, an increased temperature must necessarily have resulted, end quote, using perfect tense, referring to a point in the past, not future tense. This is well recognized by contemporary scholars. In a podcast with science historian Justin Chapereau and biochemist and science historian Roland Jackson, physics history researcher Maura Chapereau commented, quote, Eunice Foote was not saying increasing carbon dioxide will cause global warming in the future. It's more likely that she's explaining why we have these coal deposits in the first place. She's explaining a past climate, and we're looking very much in the past, end quote. The more general prediction that atmospheric insulation of heat, not specifically carbon dioxide, would raise the Earth's temperature in the future was made in the 19th century, but it wasn't made by Foote. In fact, it was made nearly 30 years earlier by Joseph Fouet in a paper originally published in French in 1824, then later published in English in 1837 in the American Journal of Science and Arts under the title General Remarks on the Temperature of the Terrestrial Globe and the Planetary Spaces. As we have seen previously, unlike Foote, Fouet remarked on the important distinction between the sun's visible light radiation and its invisible thermal radiation. After describing the mechanism of this heating, Fouet wrote, quote, "The establishment and progress of human society and the action of natural powers may, in extensive regions, produce remarkable changes in the state of the surface, the distribution of the waters, and the great movements of the air. Such effects, in the course of some centuries, must produce variations in the mean temperature for such places." End quote. Not only is that an actual prediction of the future heating of the Earth due to the insulating properties of the atmosphere, though not, of course, specifically carbon dioxide, Fouet even correctly identified human activity as a causal component. But we don't see articles with titles like, "This 19th century French mathematician warned the world about anthropogenic global warming, but no one listened because racism." Again, it is very important to note that Fouet did not identify carbon dioxide specifically as a gas contributing significantly to this insulating effect. He does not appear to have known that, whereas Foote did draw this conclusion. Conclusion. We love stories of people overcoming hardship. We love stories of brilliant independent thinkers, and we love stories of countercultural individuals succeeding against social oppression. We especially love stories of individuals in minority groups contributing well beyond what others think they are capable of. But we should really be more appreciative of small incremental achievements rather than only singling out those which appear the most dramatic. Would Eunice Foote's scientific experimentation have received so much attention if she hadn't made her comments on carbon dioxide? It's very unlikely. Yet, in her time and place, the very fact that she was following contemporary scientific discussions, devising and carrying out her own experiments, and being published in scholarly literature was a significant achievement. Similarly, is it important to identify Foote as the mother of climate change science on the basis of one experiment, the results of which she didn't fully understand, from which she drew a happily correct conclusion, while overlooking her achievements in the pursuit of the abolition of slavery and the establishment of women's rights? We should question why we privilege her scientific work while sidelining her social activism, which indisputably had a far greater social worth and impact than her scientific experiments. None of this is a criticism of Foote's scientific knowledge and skill, nor should she be faulted for not understanding her own experiment. As we've seen, the science in which she was involved was literally cutting edge at the time, and basically no one had a true model of the physics of global warming until much later. Even the much used metaphor of the greenhouse is in fact not strictly accurate, though it is useful to communicate the basic concepts to people who aren't scientifically trained, such as myself. A correct understanding of the physics of climate change science would not be reached until the end of the 19th century as a result of the accumulated work of Horace Bénédict de Saussure, Joseph Fouet, Claude Pouillet, Louis Agassiz, John Tyndall, Samuel Langley, Svante Arrhenius, and Arvid Högboom over a period of more than 100 years. All of these men made important contributions, but none of them can be said to have been individually responsible for the establishment of climate science. Tyndall, Arrhenius, and Högboom have all been called the father of climate change science, or the father of the greenhouse effect, yet all three of them were drawing on nearly a century or more of previous scientific work. We should really move away from this idea of who was the single father or mother of a specific field of science, especially when that field is fraught with complexity. Although it's common for individuals in the history of science to be identified as individually responsible for significant paradigm shifts and new discoveries, the reality is almost always more nuanced. This fact was recognized by Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientific minds in human history, who wrote, quote, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," end quote. This is a far better attitude. A final comment on this point belongs to science communicator Dr. Alice Bell, who writes, quote, There is no eureka moment with one great genius in climate change science, end quote. Rather, she says, it is, quote, a story of people over centuries and different disciplines incrementally learning more and more, end quote. In my next video response to Simon, I'll address these topics. 1. Was Foote's work stolen? 2. Is Foote's work critiqued unfairly? 3. Was Foote's work suppressed by misogynists? I hope you enjoyed this video and that you'll find the second one equally satisfying.